King Charles III just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally breaking his sovereign silence and confronting the most audacious act of familial defiance ever attempted against the modern throne, shattering the fragile diplomatic ceasefire that had held between father and son for nearly 2 agonizing years. The monarch, long cast as the reluctant peacemaker, the weary patriarch caught between 2 warring princes, the grieving father clinging to the last threads of a fractured dynasty, has now been forced to abandon every solemn vow of restraint he made to himself the night his coronation crown was lifted from his head. What began as a routine Thursday morning at Windsor, a scheduled strategy briefing, a quiet cup of Earl Grey, the soft rustle of red boxes being opened, detonated into a full-scale royal emergency, the moment a single sheet of embossed cream paper was slid across the mahogany surface of the king's private study. What exactly did Prince Harry present at that restricted Windsor entrance that made 2 of Britain's most senior courtiers physically recoil? Why did Prince William, upon being informed, allegedly lock the doors of Adelaide Cottage and refuse to take his brother's call for the 7th time in as many hours? And what devastating final line, written in a hand that was not Harry's, not William's, and not any authorized member of the royal households, finally compelled the King of the United Kingdom to slam his fist against a Georgian desk that had not felt such force since the abdication crisis of 1936. The morning had begun with the peculiar stillness that only Windsor in late autumn seems to possess, a stillness so complete that even the ravens on the round tower seemed to hold their breath. A pale watery light filtered through the tall mullioned windows of the king's private apartments, casting long, distorted rectangles across the Persian rug that Queen Victoria had commissioned in 1868. Dust motes drifted lazily through the shafts of sunlight, catching against the gilded frames of the Van Dyck portraits that lined the corridor leading to the study. The scent of aged paper, beeswax polish, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco, a ghost of Prince Philip that no amount of cleaning had ever fully banished, hung in the air like a benediction. On the mahogany desk, arranged with the meticulous precision that had defined Charles's working habits for over 50 years, sat 3 red boxes, a cut crystal tumbler of water, a fountain pen bearing the cipher of his late mother, and a single cream-colored envelope that had not been there 10 minutes before. The envelope was unremarkable in its exterior. No crest, no wax seal, no return address. Yet the moment the king's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, placed it upon the blotter, his knuckles were white and his breath was shallow. He had read the contents. He had needed to sit down afterward. And now, standing at attention beside the desk with a rigidity that betrayed decades of institutional discipline, he watched as his sovereign reached slowly, almost reluctantly, for the paper inside. For nearly 2 years, the world had spoken for King Charles. Commentators had speculated on his exhaustion. Biographers had projected onto him every emotion from paternal despair to icy detachment, and the tabloids had feasted upon his silences as though they were confessions. Today, at last, he was speaking for himself. He unfolded the letter with hands that had only that morning been steady enough to sign 3 separate acts of state. Now they trembled. The document was a formal request for access, a security clearance authorization, bearing all the correct formatting, the correct margins, the correct institutional language. It requested immediate admission to a restricted strategy meeting scheduled for 11 o'clock that morning in the Oak Room, a meeting concerning the future architecture of the monarchy itself. The requesting party was named at the top of the page, Prince Henry Charles Albert David, Duke of Sussex, and beneath that name, in the space reserved for the authorizing signatory, was a title Charles had personally bestowed, personally protected, and personally reserved for the man who would one day sit upon his throne. Prince of Wales, William's title, William's authority, William's signature, or at least something that had been made to resemble it with unnerving fidelity. Sir Clive did not speak. He did not need to. The king's face, always so carefully composed, so long rehearsed in the arts of aristocratic restraint, had drained of every ounce of color. "When?" Charles asked, his voice growly low, weighted with something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but some terrible marriage of the two. "Did this arrive?" 12 minutes ago, sir. Delivered by hand to the North Gate. His Royal Highness the Duke of Sussex is currently waiting outside the King Henry VIII Gate. He is requesting immediate entry under the terms outlined in that document, and His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales." A pause. A dreadful, suffocating pause. "Prince William is at Adelaide Cottage, sir. He has not been informed. He has not signed anything. My office has just concluded. The signature is a forgery." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that reshapes history. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, and Charles found his mind pulled backward, unwillingly, into the past. He was suddenly not in Windsor, but at Highgrove in the summer of 1995, standing on the lawn as 2 small boys ran across the grass toward him. Harry, all fire and mischief, his ginger hair catching the sunlight, had grabbed William's ceremonial toy sword, a wooden thing Diana had bought at some village fete, and had held it aloft with a triumphant cry. "I'm the king now. William says I can be." And William, patient even then, patient in the way only firstborn sons of doomed marriages ever learn to be, had simply shaken his head and said, in a voice too old for a boy of 13, "You can't take what isn't yours, Harry. It doesn't work like that. It never works like that." Diana had watched from the terrace, a cigarette burning forgotten between her fingers, and had murmured to the nanny standing beside her, "One day, that boy will try, and it will break them both." The scent of white gardenias from Diana's perfume, the rhythmic click of a distant croquet mallet, the particular quality of that Gloucestershire light, all of it flooded back into Charles now. 3 decades collapsed into a single held breath, and he understood, with the terrible clarity that only fathers of prophetic mothers ever come to know, that the moment Diana had foreseen had finally arrived. He pressed a button beneath the desk. Within 90 seconds, 3 men entered the study without knocking, a privilege reserved for the most senior officers of the royal household. The master of the household, the head of royalty and specialist protection, and a 4th figure, one who never appeared in official photographs, whose name did not feature in any published court circular, whose presence in the room caused even Sir Clive to look faintly ill. He wore a charcoal suit of the kind favored by senior civil servants in the 1970s, polished Oxford shoes that made no sound upon the parquet, and carried a slim leather portfolio clipped to a clipboard bearing the discreet insignia of a department that officially did not exist. His eyes were cold, pale gray, unblinking. He had served 4 sovereigns. He had, by his own quiet admission to select confidants, been the man who had drafted the operational parameters of the 1997 Paris Protective Detail, the detail that had, in the small hours of an August morning, so catastrophically failed to protect a princess. He was one of the men in gray, and he had been waiting patiently, for years, for a moment, precisely like this one. "Sir," he said, his voice a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout, "the situation at the North Gate is escalating. His Royal Highness the Duke of Sussex has been informed that his authorization is being verified. He is becoming agitated. He is claiming, sir, that he has documentation, additional documentation, that he wishes to present directly to your Majesty. He is also claiming, and I must stress that we cannot yet verify this, that the meeting scheduled for 11 o'clock concerns matters directly affecting his children's constitutional position, and that he has, in his own words, a right, granted by his brother, to be present." Charles closed his eyes. Outside, the wind had risen slightly, and a single dry leaf skittered across the stone flags of the terrace beyond the window. "Bring him to the Equerries' room, not the Oak Room, not this study. The Equerries' room, and find William. Find him now. I don't care if he is asleep. I don't care if he is bathing his children. Find him. Sir, there is one further matter." The man in gray stepped forward, and from the leather portfolio he withdrew a second envelope. This one bore a wax seal, crimson, unbroken, stamped with a crest that Charles had not seen in nearly 30 years. It was not a Windsor crest. It was not a Mountbatten crest. It was the private seal of the Spencer family, and more specifically, of the 9th Earl Spencer's personal cipher, used only for correspondence of the most sensitive nature. This was attached to the reverse of the forged authorization, sir, concealed within the lining of the envelope. We only discovered it when the document was examined under ultraviolet. The mechanical click of the wax seal breaking beneath the king's thumbnail was, in that hushed room, as loud as a pistol shot. Inside was a single sheet of paper, aged cream-colored, faintly foxed at the edges. And upon it, in a handwriting that Charles knew, that Charles had loved and feared and mourned for over a quarter of a century, were words that made the King of the United Kingdom sink slowly into his chair. It was Diana's hand. It was dated the 14th of August, 1997, 17 days before Paris. Across the country, the machinery of modern communication had already begun to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Encrypted feeds between Buckingham Palace and Windsor were being routed and rerouted through backup servers as palace communications officers scrambled to contain a story that had not yet broken, but that every seasoned royal correspondent in London could feel forming, the way sailors feel a storm long before the horizon darkens. In pubs across Edinburgh, the lunchtime crowd was beginning to gather around televisions where the BBC News banner had suddenly changed from a story about interest rates to a live shot of the Long Walk at Windsor. In Cardiff, in Belfast, in Manchester, in the quiet suburbs of Guildford where retired civil servants read their papers over toast, screens flickered simultaneously. 20 million people, though they did not yet know why, were about to hold their collective breath. The nation, without being told, had already begun to sense that the machinery of the palace was cornered. Charles read Diana's letter twice, then a third time. His breath had hitched somewhere in his chest and refused to move. "My darling Charles," it began, and the intimacy of it, after all these years, after all the tabloid cruelties, and the divorce, and the whispered accusations, and the terrible, terrible ending, was almost more than he could bear. "If this letter reaches you, it is because the failsafe has been triggered. I have left it with Charles Spencer, my brother, with instructions that it be delivered only in the event that one of our boys attempts to seize what belongs to the other. I know you will think me paranoid. I know you will think me theatrical. But I have seen the way the men in gray look at Harry when they think no one is watching. I have heard them, Charles. I have heard them in the corridors at Kensington, speaking of him as though he were a piece on a board. They will use him. They will use his loneliness, his anger, his grief for me. Because they know there will be grief, Charles, they know, and they will turn him against his brother. Not next year, not in 5 years, but in 25, 30, when William is closest to the throne, when Harry is furthest from it, when the wound is deepest. They have a name for this operation. I heard it whispered once, and I will write it here only once, and you must burn this letter after you have read it, though I know you never will. The operation is called the antique rotary telephone on the king's desk, the one that had not rung in 3 years, the one connected to a single private line known only to William, to Anne, and to the king himself, began to ring. Charles stared at it. Sir Clive stared at it. The man in gray, for the first time in perhaps a decade, appeared to blink. Charles lifted the receiver with a hand that no longer belonged to him. Papa, William's voice, but not William's voice. Stripped of sovereign authority, stripped of the careful, measured cadence of the Prince of Wales, stripped down to something that sounded, for one devastating moment, exactly like the broken sob of a 15-year-old boy walking behind a coffin down the mall in September of 1997. Papa, they've just told me, my office has just told me, my signature, my title, Papa, I know, William, I know you didn't. He's outside the gate, isn't he, Harry? He's really outside. A silence, the kind of silence in which entire dynasties are rebuilt or destroyed. Papa, don't let him in. Not yet. Not until Papa, there's something you need to know, something Mummy told me. Something she made me promise never to say unless the day came, and Papa, I think the day has come, the line cut. Not disconnected, cut. Somewhere, in some anonymous room in Vauxhall or Whitehall, or perhaps a great deal closer to Windsor than anyone would ever officially admit, someone had severed a royal telephone call between a king and his heir. Charles set the receiver down very slowly. He looked up at the man in gray, and for the first time in his life, the King of the United Kingdom addressed one of the invisible architects of his family's suffering not as a sovereign to a servant, but as a father to an enemy. You will leave this room. You will leave this castle. You will surrender your past to the master of the household within the hour, and you will consider yourself from this moment a private citizen of no further use to this institution. The man in gray did not move. He smiled, a thin, cold, terrifying smile that had witnessed the fall of 4 prime ministers and the rise of 3. With respect, sir, I do not answer to your majesty in the manner you suppose. I answer to the institution. And the institution. The institution, Charles said, rising to his full height for the first time that morning, his voice no longer trembling, but forged now from something harder than steel, is me. It has always been me. It was my mother before me, and it will be my son after me, and it was never at any point in its 1,000-year history you. Get out of my sight. The moment stretched. Then, with a bow so slight it verged on insolence, the man in gray turned and left the room. Sir Clive exhaled as though he had been holding his breath since 1997. And Charles, alone now with his private secretary and the head of his protection command, returned his gaze to the unfinished letter from a woman 30 years dead. The final paragraph, the paragraph he had not yet read, waited for him in Diana's looping, urgent hand. But before he could bring himself to read it, another memory rose. Balmoral, Christmas 1992, the year of the Annus Horribilis. Diana had cornered him in the library after the boys were asleep, her hair still damp from the rain, her eyes fierce. Promise me, Charles. Promise me that whatever happens between us, whatever they do to us, whatever they make us do to each other, you will never let them turn William and Harry into weapons against one another. Promise me, because they will try. They have already begun. I have seen the memos, Charles. I have seen the names. He had promised. He had promised, and then he had forgotten, and now, 32 years later, the memos she had warned him of had finally borne their poisoned fruit at the north gate of Windsor Castle, in the person of his own younger son, brandishing a forged signature and a false authority, and, somewhere behind him, invisible but present, the hand of the very apparatus his late wife had begged him to dismantle. He read the final paragraph. The name of the operation, Charles, is Nightingale. And the man who runs it, the man who will one day try to use our Harry as the instrument of our William's destruction, is the same man who, if I am right about Paris, will already have arranged for me to be somewhere. I should not have been on a night. I should not have been there. His name is... And then, in a hand that was no longer Diana's but that of her brother Charles Spencer, appended in a different ink and clearly added years later, a single sentence. Sister, I have kept your letter, and I have watched him. He is still there. He was in the oak room this morning. Do what she could not. The king closed his eyes. Somewhere beyond the walls of Windsor, 20 million televisions were now showing a live shot of Prince Harry standing at the King Henry VIII gate, his coat collar turned up against the wind, his face drawn, exhausted, and Charles saw now with a father's terrible clarity, utterly manipulated. Harry did not know. Harry had been given the documents. Harry had been told they were legitimate. Harry believed, in the desperate, wounded corner of his soul that had never healed since the age of 12, that his brother had finally opened a door for him. And someone who had waited nearly 30 years, had planned it that way. Sir Clive, sir, escort my son to the equerry's room. Personally, do not let anyone else near him. Not one person. If anyone from the household attempts to intervene, you will place them under the direct authority of the head of protection, who will detain them. Is that understood perfectly, sir? And find William. I want him here within the hour. Helicopter if necessary. I do not care about the weather. I do not care about protocol. I want my sons in the same room, together, for the first time in 5 years. And I want them to see this letter, both of them, at the same time. Sir Clive hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second. Sir, the letter, its contents, if it is released, or if it is even acknowledged within the walls of the household, the implications for the events of 1997 will be catastrophic. Yes, I know. Charles looked out the window, at the pale autumn sky, at the ravens circling the round tower, at the country that had trusted his family for 1,000 years to hold the line between duty and personal ruin. Let it be catastrophic. Let it be devastating. My wife tried to tell me the truth for 26 years, and I did not listen. My son has been used as a weapon against his brother, and I did not see it. Let the machinery burn. My boys come first. The next 40 minutes were, by every account that would ever be pieced together in the years afterward by the biographers and the historians and the quiet, careful writers of the definitive volumes, the most consequential 40 minutes of Charles III's reign. Harry was escorted, bewildered and defensive and increasingly frightened, into the equerry's room, where he sat in a wingback chair and refused water and demanded to know why his authorized meeting had been delayed. William arrived by car, the helicopter having been grounded, ostensibly for weather, more likely for reasons that Sir Clive would decline to specify in his eventual memoirs, his face pale, his jaw set, his hands, when he removed his gloves, trembling in a way that no photograph would ever capture. And Charles, king and father, walked into that room with Diana's letter in his hand, and the wax seal broken and 30 years of institutional silence about to shatter like the crystal tumbler that would. Before the morning was over, lie in shards upon the parquet floor. Boys, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had at last remembered a promise made in a rain-damp library at Balmoral. Sit down, both of you, and listen to me, because your mother is about to speak, for the first time in 27 years, and I need you to hear her. Together. Harry looked at William. William looked at Harry. And in that single, silent, devastating exchange of glances, 30 years of manufactured distance began at last to collapse. The letter was read aloud, every word. The name of the operation. The name of the man. The name that Diana had heard whispered in the corridors of Kensington in the summer of 1997. The name that Charles Spencer had appended in his own hand years later, with the confirmation that the man was still inside the palace, still operating, still, as of that very morning, attending strategy meetings in the oak room of Windsor Castle. And when the name was spoken aloud, William's knuckles whitened around the arm of his chair, and Harry, who had spent 5 years believing his brother was his enemy, let out a sound that no adult man should ever have to make. A sound that was neither sob nor shout, but something older, something primal, the sound of a boy of 12 realizing at last who had been holding the knife all along. He drafted the Paris protective detail, William said, his voice cracked hollow. Yes, he was the one who, yes, and he made me. Harry could not finish. He did not need to. William reached across the small space between their chairs and took his brother's hand. The first time their hands had touched in that manner since the funeral, since the long walk behind the gun carriage, since the moment two motherless boys had held each other up in front of a watching world and been separated systematically, methodically, cruelly. Ever since. Outside, the ravens on the round tower rose suddenly into the air, wheeling against the pale sky as though some ancient signal had passed through the old stones of Windsor. Across the country, 20 million viewers watched a live shot of a castle gate that no one was leaving and no one was entering, and something, though they could not have said what, something enormous, something long overdue, was taking place behind those walls. The name of the man was released to a select committee of the Privy Council by 6 o'clock that evening. By 7, he had been detained, quietly, without fanfare, under legislation that had never before been invoked against a serving member of the royal household. By 8, 3 additional courtiers had been suspended. By 9, Buckingham Palace had issued a single unprecedented statement, 6 words long, "The King stands with his sons." No further comment was offered, no press briefing was held. The machinery of the palace, for the first time in living memory, had gone completely, terrifyingly silent. And in the equerry's room at Windsor, long after the tea had gone cold and the ravens had returned to their perches and the pale autumn light had begun to fail, two brothers sat with their father, and the letter from their mother lay open on a small table between them, and none of them spoke, because none of them needed to. Diana had finally been heard, the failsafe had held, the prophecy, precise to the day, precise to the name, had been fulfilled. Charles rose at last and walked to the window. He looked out at the country his mother had left him, the country his sons would one day inherit, the country his wife had loved with a fierceness that had ultimately cost her everything. He thought of the wooden sword on the Highgrove lawn in the summer of 1995, and of William's small, wise voice saying, "You can't take what isn't yours," and of Diana, on the terrace with her cigarette forgotten, murmuring one day, "That boy will try, and it will break them both." It had not broken them. It had, by the narrowest, most agonizing of margins, by the grace of a letter kept safe for 27 years by a grieving brother in a Northamptonshire library, saved them. He turned back to his sons. Harry was crying silently, the tears running unchecked down a face that had aged a decade in a single afternoon. William was holding him, awkwardly, the way older brothers always hold younger ones when they have forgotten how, but remembered why. And Charles, King of the United Kingdom, defender of the faith, sovereign of a 1,000-year institution that had, that very morning, come within a forged signature of destroying itself from within, sat down beside his boys and, for the first time since he had been a small child at Balmoral, wept. Across Britain, the broadcast cut, at last, to black. There was no music, there was no commentary. The BBC anchor, visibly moved, said only that a statement would be issued in due course, and that viewers were asked to respect the privacy of the family at this time. In pubs from Edinburgh to Plymouth, pint glasses were set down. In living rooms from Belfast to Norwich, remotes were lowered. A nation that had spent nearly 3 decades speculating, judging, dividing itself over the tragedy of a princess and the estrangement of her sons, sat in stunned, reverent, unbroken silence. The letter would, in time, be placed beneath the memorial stone at Althorpe, upon the small island where Diana rested. The name of the operation would appear in no official document, but it would be whispered, for years afterward in the corridors of Whitehall and Westminster, as a warning to any who thought the institution larger than the family it served. And Harry, who had come to the north gate of Windsor that morning, believing he was seizing what had been denied him, left that evening in a car with his brother, the two of them side by side in the back seat, saying nothing, their hands still touching on the leather between them, on their way, at last, home. The Swallow had finally flown free. The men in grey had at last been named. The mother's voice, silenced for 27 years, had spoken. And the king, the reluctant, weary, long underestimated king, had in a single autumn morning at Windsor kept the only promise that had ever truly mattered. The truth had saved her boys. The broadcast cut to black. The nation held its breath. The secret was out.